I, and others who critique the story of Joseph Smith's polygamy, are often obliquely accused of sexism because we don't believe the stories of women. But among the many problems with that shallow line of thinking is the fact that the sources are often not the women at all. As we saw with Fanny Alger, there is no good evidence that she said anything about her alleged relationship with Joseph. The situation is similar with Louisa Beaman, whose name is spelled either with one E, two E's, or an EA, depending on who's writing. The earliest hint of any relationship between Louisa Beaman and Joseph Smith comes from the disgraced serial adulterer John Bennett in his lurid and sensationalist 1842 book, The History of the Saints, or An Exposé of Joe Smith and Mormonism. On page 229, Bennett claims that Joseph, after having his affections rebuffed by Sarah Pratt, then went off to see Miss Louisa Beaman at the house of Mrs. Sherman, and remained with her about 2 hours. How Bennett knows this is a mystery. Was he waiting outside the whole time? Where were Mrs. Sherman and her family? We wonder in vain, for Bennett never provides answers. On page 256, Bennett asserts that among the vast number of Joseph's secret wives was L.B., presumably Louisa Beaman, married to him by Joseph Noble. Keep that in mind, it will be important later. Although there are many affidavits countering Bennett's claims, there seems to be no record of Louisa saying anything about it. However, she does get baptized, apparently by Joseph Smith himself, on 11 May 1843. Nothing is apparently said on the subject of a relationship between Joseph and Louisa for the next 2 years. On 19 September 1844, 3 months after Joseph's death, Louisa is married to him posthumously in the Nauvoo Temple. The same day, she becomes a plural wife of Brigham Young. In the next 4 years, she had 5 children by Brigham, 2 sets of twins and 1 singleton, all of whom died as infants. On 15 May 1850, Louisa died in Salt Lake City, preceded by all her children. She was 35. That's the end of Louisa's story, but not the end of the stories about her. In 1850, the year after Louisa died, John Lee noted in his journal that someone, apparently George Smith, named a new settlement in Utah Louisa because he was a particular favorite of the ladies. But Lee contradicts himself in the next sentence. But the writer says, it was in honor of the first woman who listened to the light and voice of revelation and yielded obedience to the seal of the covenant, but since has taken her exit to the world of spirits, and for this noble act her name is held in honorable remembrance in the history of the saints. Presumably this is referring to Louisa Beaman, but the stilted language makes it sound like another altered history recorded after the fact. Especially when Lee's next doubtful line is, but how this little meet the approbation of the brethren is hereafter to be determined. Despite this apparent concern about the name not meeting the approbation of the brethren, it's Lee himself who makes the motion to adopt the name. Sure enough, Brigham Young at a later date vetoed the name Louisa, his plural wife and allegedly the first woman to yield obedience to the seal of the covenant, in favor of the name of a nearby lake, Parowan, a strange way for her name to be held in honorable remembrance, especially since her name is apparently not mentioned at all for another 18 years. So it is possible that Lee wrote this after 1869, when the story became fully established. After all, it wasn't until 1877 that John Lee was executed after being convicted of mass murder for the Mountain Meadows Massacre. On January 22, 1869, a dinner party was held for the first presidency and many apostles. Franklin Richards wrote in his journal that Brother Joseph B. Noble, being master of ceremonies, was present, and during the visit related that he performed the first sealing ceremony in this dispensation, in which he united Sister Louisa Beaman to the Prophet Joseph in May, I think the 5th day, in 1841, during the evening under an elm tree in Nauvoo, the bride disguised in a coat and hat. You might also notice that it says, see page 146, and you might wonder what's on that page. It just so happens to be Richard's account of Brigham Young giving him a newspaper business, a new lot for a second house, and having the church pay over $3,000 in debt that Richards owed Brigham, which would be almost $100,000 adjusted for inflation. And if you think there's anything suspicious about Richards connecting this sudden generosity of Brigham Young with Richards recording Noble's story about Joseph Smith's polygamy, you are probably a crazy conspiracy theorist. A According to Wilfred Woodruff's journal entry for the same day, Noble said that he married Louisa Beaman to Joseph on 6 May 1841. Not only does that contradict what Richard said, it also contradicts what Woodruff wrote in his official historian's journal in an undated entry recorded at about this time, that Noble married them on May blank 1840. But then it seems that there was no generosity from Brigham to Woodruff, so you can hardly blame him for not getting the details right. In June of that year, the story is straightened out by Joseph F. Smith, who in his crusade to establish Joseph Smith's polygamy, has Noble sign two separate affidavits on the same day, 26 June 1869. One states that in 1840 Joseph Smith taught Noble about polygamy and asked for his assistance in carrying it out, and the other that on the new official date of 5 April 1841, 28 years earlier, Noble performed the marriage of Joseph and Louisa. This date is exactly 2 years before Noble married his first plural wife, 5 April 1843. About a month before, Hiram Smith denounced, again, having many wives as an abomination. Incidentally, when Noble signed the affidavits, he had 8 wives, including 2 he married when they were 14-year-old girls. The story is repeated in pretty much the same format by many people over the next years, although at least one source reports that Noble used the 1840 date again. The good folks at Hemlock Knots have a nice timeline that I'll link to in the notes. There's nothing directly from Noble except the affidavits he signed until the Temple Lot case in 1892. At 82 years old, 51 years after the alleged events, Noble is finally questioned about what happened. It's probably the most hilariously bad testimony from the Temple Lot case. In between extended pauses, complaints, and cursing, Noble stumbles through a self-contradictory deposition that is starkly at odds with the official affidavits that were written for him. For instance, according to Franklin Richards, Noble said that he had performed the marriage under an elm tree in Nauvoo in the deepening twilight, with Louisa disguised in a coat and hat. But in the Temple Lot testimony, Noble says, "I married them in my house. I owned the block there. I owned the whole of it, house and everything that was in it, and it was in that house they were married. I have the deed right here in my pocket, and I gave $5,000 for it." Noble certainly did pay $5,000 for a whole block of land in Nauvoo on July 15, 1841, 2 months after the alleged marriage. Now, I'm sure that a creative apologist will find explanations for these contradictions, and still support the claim that Joseph Noble married Louisa Beaman to Joseph Smith. But that raises far more questions than it answers. For instance, assuming that Bennett's L.B. is Louisa Beaman, how did he know about a marriage so secret that she had to be disguised when the marriage was performed under the cover of dusk? Why was Joseph allegedly married to Louisa 2 years before she was even baptized? Noble was confronted with the same fact in the Temple Lot case, and after saying he couldn't remember, claimed that she must have been baptized, because otherwise his story doesn't make sense. It's possible that it was a rebaptism, as Todd Compton claims, but there's no evidence for that. The polygamy apologists simply assume it must be so, because otherwise their story doesn't work. Compton even apparently invents the word sisters in the journal to try to tie the event to the Partridge sisters, alleged plural wives of Joseph. Speaking of inventing evidence, Brian Hales claims that on the back of an application to join the Relief Society, someone scribbled a list of Joseph's plural wives, including Louisa Beaman. Hales really wants this person to be Oliver Olney, because that would make the undated list contemporary with the early 1840s. But here in the center is the alleged list of alleged wives, and on the left and right are snippets from Olney's handwriting, comparing a few key letters. As we can see, the handwriting does not match Oliver Olney's. In fact, some of the most distinctly different letters are the L and B in Louisa Beaman. The list is much more likely to be, as the Yale University Library states, simply a list of some of the women in the Relief Society. Startlingly, Hales also sees that problematic statement of Bennett's about Joseph seeing Louisa, where no sexuality is mentioned, as evidence of Joseph and Louisa having sex. How does a dubious assertion from Joseph's bitter enemy qualify as evidence? But there are still more problems. Why do the day, month, and year of the alleged marriage keep changing, even though the only source is Noble? If Louisa was already married to Joseph before he died, Why was she married to him posthumously in the Nauvoo temple, right before being married to Brigham Young as a plural wife? If Joseph was sleeping with Louisa, as Noble claimed, possibly even weekly, as Benjamin Winchester said in 1900, why did he not have a child with her in Nauvoo? But Brigham Young got her pregnant 3 times in 4 years, while he was busy organizing and leading a mass migration and settlement campaign and getting his other wives pregnant. Assuming that John Lee's journal is referring to Louisa Beaman, how did he know that she had been the first to accept the doctrine? And what about Fanny Alger, who the Church now claims was first? Hales's assertion that Fanny must have just been a marriage and not an eternal marriage contradicts Doctrine and Covenants 132 and, like Compton's claims about Louisa's baptism, is simply invented out of his need to make sense of the tangled web of conflicting stories that the polygamists built to justify their practice. So then, how did the stories about Louisa get started? I'll admit I don't have a perfect answer. I think the data is too fragmentary. An alternate scenario could involve Noble, who seems to have been more than a bit of a braggart, using Bennett's claims to bolster his own clout among the polygamous Mormons. Perhaps those claims even originally started with Noble, trying to curry favor with Bennett, running his own secret sex ring as the mayor of Nauvoo, while Noble was part of Brigham's secret polygamy ring. Almost any explanation you can think of will have fewer problems than the official story. It also seems clear that the real sexists are not those who question the official story, but those participants in it who used women for power, even long after their deaths. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Until next time, this is I Believe Joseph, signing out.